First of all, I just wanted to congratulate you on being awarded the fellowship, which is why we're here today at the Stanley, which is a fellowship which carries on for a year or two while you make research, and look forward to coming back at the end of your fellowship to see how that works out. So there's a kind of dual way in which we were asked to be here today. One, to have a conversation about our practices, but in the context of fellowship. So we've kind of, in a way, having to negotiate together how to structure this and how to frame it. And one of the questions that we were kind of thinking then for, whose practice are we interrogating and who's interrogating who? So this is a really nice opening in the sense that you've got your avatar that did some work for you and that is a standard or a proxy for you at some point whilst you're here.
Yeah.
So I wonder, do you want to talk about a little bit about the project that was speaking to and with, or how would you like to?
I can go straight into it in a way. This is a sort of a clip. I'm going to start again, maybe. I've just come out of a very long project. It's taken about 4 to 5 years to sort of work on a body of work that started off looking at a particular historical figure, a minor historical figure is what I call her. She was a weaver. Her name was Halima binti Abdullah, and she came from Malaya. She came to London in 1924 and participated in the Empire exhibition. And I came across her really because I was looking at exhibition histories and thinking about, I'm from Singapore originally, and I was trying to think about the way in which Singapore and Malaysia and that region has been exhibited or been represented through exhibitions. And so this was one of the kind of earliest exhibitions I kind of came across, and she was a figure that you might consider to be an artist today that went somewhere else in the world, as you and I have done, and we'll see with your work too, that you've been elsewhere. And she went there because she was there to sell and also show her work.
Is that in the context of the kind of trade exhibitions?
Trade exhibitions.
It also contained artwork.
Yeah,
A big
I mean,
feature of
she wasn't considered an artist, and there was in that same 1924 Empire exhibition, there was an area where contemporary or fine art was exhibited. But she was showing work within these pavilions. So she was showing work in a Malayan pavilion, and she, during the day, she demonstrated weaving and soul weaving, and at night she went behind the exhibition space and lived with 19 other people behind the space. And she became interesting to me because she died. She got pneumonia and she died, and her body wasn't returned to Malaya. And I've been exploring questions around repatriation, and so I was interested in the idea of potentially repatriating her somehow or other. And I think the other, it becomes the way in which I was ending up exploring this. But before coming today, we sort of talked about various things that arise in both of our practices, and one of them, sorry Mel, I'm kind of slightly taking over, but I remember one of them was something about positions and where you speak from, and also historical information, and you probably better put it. But she, this piece, the clip, the reason I opened it with this was that in trying to explore how to work with this historical figure, not to stand in for her, not to speak for her, but sometimes doing so, I also realised that she was a bit of a tool for me. I was riding on the back of this particular female figure, whilst also trying to address the lack of representation. It was also addressing my own lack of representation, and actually what I was doing was using her in a way to go home, because she is what takes me to the Venice Biennale, but also potentially this is going to be bought in Singapore, and she takes me home to Singapore and into a collection there.
Right. And yeah, I mean, one of the things, I suppose, the opening questions that we had when we just began the preamble on how we might introduce this, was I'm really interested in kind of modes of storytelling. And I don't mean modes of telling a whole story or telling her story, but there is a point at which you need to introduce her as an historical figure to give us that information so that then we can read the work. And I've been really interested in that in all of my work. There's an element of bringing in I was really interested in historical materialism, how materials, goods, services get manufactured and how that creates subjects. And subjects exactly in the way that she was taken almost to talk about what Singapore could offer as a kind of economic product. Both to interrogate and critique that, but also to figure out how that subject formation operates. But I've always it's always been a fascination with me how one introduces non-fiction material, should we say, into a body of work without having to how does one introduce the story or the context? And one thing I found really exciting about your work is the kind of inventive strategies that you have that doesn't involve just simply putting her name in a press release, which is often the default place where non-fiction goes in an artwork. There's a page of explanation to understand what the story is beginning to unpick or unfurl or challenge. And I think this idea of kind of having proxies in the digital avatar, and I thought in that piece particularly you used many different ways of accepting that you weren't telling her story, you were kind of talking with her story in a way. And structurally, I think it's a huge problem when you're making artwork, when you've got a great narrative kind of relationship, where to put the narrative, how to express it. And for me, a solution is often to use publication, to use things that are not catalogues or explanations of the work, but something that absolutely is part of it and embedded in it. Yeah. And I was just really interested in some of the ways that you've used these kind of split objects
Well, for this work, I am actually working on a publication at the moment, and I'm finding it quite difficult because the research is sort of like here, and the project is here, and then the book becomes this, and how to somehow bring it all together. And in the work that I eventually made, there is a mention, it's right at the end, where there's a line that says her name was Halima binti Abdul. But before that, there's about 30 minutes worth of various things that happen and ways in which there's an unfolding of who she is.
So she doesn't foreground the story, she's kind of revealed.
She's revealed, but she is the subject of the thing. And it might be easy if I just try and see. So this is one of the ways in which this forgotten weaver, and forgotten is like, who's forgetting who, is materialised, and it's in a sort of structure that's an expanded, could be a loom, and when you sit inside it, there are moments in time which there is some kind of addressing of the fact that you're sitting in a space that could be a loom. This is another image. So if I run through very quickly maybe some of the information that we talked about. So these are, this is where I found her, these are the footnotes. From Singapore, Halima, I've underlined that because my first reading of this and notation from it, I saw Halima was coming from Singapore. I wrote that down. Halima's from Singapore. Wow, great, I can make this project that somehow connects me back to Singapore. Later on, I came back to this and realised the comma was in the wrong place, and actually Halima's not from Singapore, she's from Malaya. She's from Johor, and it's fundamentally now a different country. And then, I think here is where she, something about her getting ill. So this is the Malayan Pavilion in the Empire Exhibition. This is an image that I came across which was quite fundamental because I was looking for Halima. Where could I find an image of her? And this was an image of the 19 people that lived inside the pavilion. And where there are two women there, but they're not named, and they're just called Malay Lady. So whilst we talk about information and archives, my experience as coming from a kind of post-colonial kind of country is that the archive that's available to us is incredibly full of holes.
Sure.
And so when we have a moment where we might be able to identify somebody and we have at that moment in time a disregard for who was actually there, then that whole sort of persists, and it's the continuity of the lack of naming or representation, even today within Singapore, that is also of interest. So this work is also about, not just about Halima, the figure in 1924, but it's about how Singapore opens up a national gallery 3 years ago, and in the Singapore story of art, there isn't a Malay female artist represented there, and Malay women art, or Malay community is about 25% of the population, so it's there's an ongoing issue here. But when you do have information too, so I had the information about where she was buried and working in Brookwood Cemetery, and there's a number there of where her grave should be. I go to the grave site and I can't find the grave because they've changed the numerical system of ordering the graves, so nobody now knows where this number is. You can't, so it's just full of impossibilities.
Sure.
And in the impossibilities and with this very minimal information, my route was, this was one of the tactics or strategies, I suppose, was to think about voice and to think about who could voice and what kind of a voice. And I was interested in the idea of live debating, partly because the debate, actual debate in Singapore is quite circumspect, but the debate form itself is a...
circumspect in what way? It's guarded? Or?
It's very guarded, you can be put in jail for saying certain things. Right. There is an actual political kind of silencing that happens. Who's in the audience? But there's a very lively debate, competition debating that goes on. And the interest in the debate for me is that it's a form where you can argue something but not believe in it. You take a role, a position, and you argue that, but it doesn't have to be what you personally believe in.
It's an intellectual game, kind of.
Yeah. So I work with a group of young debaters who primarily came from legal. They were studying law, but all of them wanted to be curators, which is very interesting. And so I gave them these small bits of information that I'd had and asked them to build up a sort of argument for how Halima might be seen as a cultural ambassador. So I could just show you one.
That Singapore historically never even had this weaving culture to begin in the first place. Therefore, it is firstly an appropriation of my own culture to take what I've done and what I am as a person and use it to be part of your narrative because it was never even part of your history.
So that's a really clever way of kind of allowing the content to be out, which might be very sensitive then in a gallery that may be wanting to buy the work, but maybe also has to admit to its own inclusions. So they're speaking for, but as a possible position rather than a claim position.
Yes, and so there's an openness to being able to speak, knowing that
it's not a personal position. Yeah, there's no accountability for it.
Yes.
Which is
the accountability thing. Yes. Also, though, at that moment in time, I asked them to do this debate as if they were Halima, so they were arguing from the position of being Halima. Later on, it changed and kind of sort of formalised it in a slightly different way, which is, you can't actually see this, so yeah, I used them again to make the proper piece of work. This was just more of a trial, really.
And how did they appear then on different screens, or how did you structure that around objects and?
This is how it ended up being. I think I might be able to. So I'll just whiz through. It's a 2-screen piece of work. There is a dancer who's 60 years old and Malay.
Arriving now again, found between the walls that separate the inside from the outside, between the courtroom cases and artwork vitrines.
She's the voice. You don't necessarily know who the voice is, but it is of the dancer. And there are moments in time where she's speaking the description of images, archival images that I'm not allowed to show because I can't afford to show them.
Because they require
patience. Yeah, and so this comes through in this project all the time. So there's also, when we're talking about information and how we deal with information, there's also information I can't show. And it's for me, it's quite a big issue because if we're talking about histories that are lesser known, and archives that
are private.
Well, archives that are not, they're owned. So I'm thinking about museums and objects that are collected in museums that never see the light of day, and images and archives that never see the light of day. And as an artist or a researcher, that when you do find them and you want to somehow bring them out in the open, and you can't afford to bring them out in the open, so there's omissions all the time, and sometimes those are not, it's not a choice to omit it. So actually a lot of my work is about trying to find ways of bringing that information in, whilst not also trying to sort of not be didactic with the way of bringing it in. But these are the debaters.
But it wasn't always this. I would suggest to you that this place has undergone change.
So this is the National Gallery before it actually opened up.
So that becomes part of the meaning, if you like, as well.
It's weaving a figure into the space before it's publicly opened to somehow embed her presence in the space before anything else takes place.
Anxiety here and now, told to look at her at a certain way. Well, she wasn't from the metropole. She was acted upon by the metropole. She was sent on a ship so far away to the 1924 Empire exhibition as a subject of the empire, as a subject of our masters.
So you do hear the storyline or the details, but through the account of as an argument, presented as an argument. These are the mock-up gallery spaces. And so here is an interesting moment where we're going through a space in the gallery that is given over to the art history of Singapore. This is called the National Canon, and it's called the Nanyang painters. And primarily, there were women involved, but they were primarily Chinese men. And they became very significant for going over to Indonesia and to Bali. And there's this whole Bali trip that they went on where they painted Malayan women.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking about the Malayan woman artist and her absence in the space, but her overly represented body in the gallery space as in this pictorial form was something that was kind of important. And then also in terms of the cleaners in the space, they were primarily Malayan women too. So there's a presence, but not in the way that...
Yeah. And also in terms of, obviously, the artist and the whole kind of Western construction of the individual is... Which so much work has been done to undermine and challenge, yet remains inherently problematic in this huge effacement of speaking for and I think it was a common practice to have actors in museum settings that were kind of next to fine art and with fine art, but performing labour.
Yeah.
Which was, so it's important. I mean, she was, obviously it's a single incident, it was a common practice, I think, in both trades fairs and museums, which were absolutely part of the same origin, which is, I think, sometimes occluded.
Well, the thing about the performing labour became interesting, and Halima performs the labour of a weaver. Just left me, train of thought. So there's two things really. One was thinking about this is 1924, and perhaps it's a method that has we've developed out of that. We don't need that. But actually, I've always thought, as an artist, when you have a private view and you have to turn up with a private view, or you're sort of turning up to do what, and sort of performing the artist as well as sort of perhaps being able to explain. One of the things I was interested about Halima, the weaver, was that if you thought of her as just a craftsperson, maybe that relegates her to a certain kind of history. But if you thought of her as also performing the role of the Malayan woman, and thought of her perhaps as a performance artist, performing something, then maybe that would shift the way that we understood her. Yeah. But the other thing was I came across in the history, in the research, that in 2008, in a museum my sister worked in Singapore, they had a show of weaving from Cambodia, and they had Cambodian weavers come down with their looms and set up and demonstrate weaving. Now, the interesting thing for me was that the loom in 1924 was left behind in England, and you can see it in the V&A. No one else had seen it before, except I went along.
It's in the stores?
It's in the stores, and no one had touched it. They got it out for me, and on they'd lost bits of it, so the posts that would have made the frame are all lost. But the interior bit is there, and there's a half-woven piece of cloth there.
Oh, wow.
And I kind of thought, well, why does a weaver leave her tools behind? What's that about? But in Singapore in 2008, the same thing happened. This Cambodian weaver came over, wove stuff, and when she left her loom behind too. And on it is a half-woven piece of textile. And then the dancer, who was doing some educational work, brought a weaver down from Malaysia who demonstrated the craft of weaving and left her loom behind with a half finished piece of textile. And all very interesting, because elements get lost, things can't get resurrected, you're left with a piece of textile that you don't know what to do. Do you finish it off? Do you cut it off? Do you continue weaving? Can you continue weaving? All these questions are quite interesting questions.
Also, what's the job of the museum in a sense? Is it to preserve it in a fixed moment?
Yes,
Or,
that's exactly.
Yeah.
In the end, they gave me the loom because they didn't know what to do with it. So I have a loom sitting in Singapore, which I'm not sure what to do with. But I did want to try and bring these three looms together. And in a show that I did, which was part of the Artist and Empire show, it was in Singapore, I got them to bring the loom from the V&A in London over to Singapore as a way of returning something. It's only temporary though, so it didn't stay. But in the process of doing that, I wanted to film the conservator at Labour conserving the loom to return back as part of the work. And I was told that if I wanted to do that, it would cost £4,000. And that was bigger than my budget. I couldn't afford to film the conservator.
Because why would it cost what?
The conservator was already being paid to do the job.
Just to represent it.
But to film her.
Wow.
So the vision of Labour was something that had to be paid extra for. And I thought that was very interesting in relationship to the Malayan weaver who was not paid to have these double roles, but she did this double role. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I've tackled that problem as well, where things aren't visible or expensive. With drawing, for me, that was.
Should we look at one drawing?
Yeah. I mean, there's two different works in a way which attacks from different angles. One of them is interesting that you've got the problem with the book now, whereas in my last exhibition it was a similar, very, very extensive 4-year period of research where I wanted to climb inside of the subject and kind of refuse to explore it in a linear way, but to explore its. It's fine. It's very bright. So I'm not going to go into this because it's a really long piece of work. But there was an issue perhaps with where the book belongs and how it fits. And I found working on the book to be absolutely as complex as making the films. You know, to how to fold that in. And in a way we use the structure of the book to tell a story. So I actually decided to fold it in as a kind of reading room. So the gallery itself became a reading room and a receptacle for the book, as well as having films, images, sculptures and things that made that conducive. And mine was actually, it was all about milk and the alienation, I suppose, of women from the industrial metaphysics and having it as an industrial staple, which it is in so many countries now. And there's histories of modernity, histories of colonialism, histories of whiteness. So many things fold into milk as both a cultural substance, but then it's taken over as from a bodily substance. So we were looking at that kind of great process. So similarly had strategies of wanting to use bits of archival information and not being able to, so I just stole them and hoped for the best. From Tetra Pak and various papers. And it's an interesting thing, like in America you can use anything from any public source. So for an advert or a film, you can use a still for educational purposes in any context, in a magazine, as long as it's not primarily for profit. Whereas in this country actually has the strictest copyright laws in the world. And interestingly, actually when I went to the Oceana exhibition recently, all the stuff that's come from New Zealand you're allowed to photograph. All the stuff that's come from the British Museum in Britain, owned by us, not allowed to take pictures of. And there's a huge kind of control in this country, I think, about.
Yeah, it's not just here. But
No, of course.
Singapore takes its, it often follows Britain in terms of its policies.
And legal structures, yeah. So anyway, I was looking at kind of milk as an abstraction, as a representation, and similarly exploring like how something with great complexity can be corralled into a kind of shape. So I really want to just talk about how the book formed as part of that rather than the whole subject, because I think I've got other works that probably have similar problems. But yeah, I was really interested then in using avatars as well, just kind of avatars of alienation and avatars of, I found this extraordinary. I found a whole portion of the internet which is devoted to the physics of making tits bounce effectively. Men doing physics, well, attractively, I don't know, of making kind of real-time motion. There's a whole huge amount of physics spent doing this, which I think, this is a really great use of technology. But I was really interested in,
What's that?
These are images from the exhibition, and I called it Deeper in the Pyramid because I was interested in the moment that we're in. There's a huge resurgence of interest in the mystical and the magical and the kind of non-human powers of persuasion that are used both by the right, used by Trump in this kind of chaos magic, and then also by the left as a kind of redemptive space where non-enlightenment knowledge might be used. So I was interested in that as a construct, but it's also an economic policy of all the big corporates in the world now they feel like they've exhausted all the money in the West at the top of the pyramid. So the idea is you dig deeper and you encourage brand loyalty amongst incredibly poor people who earn between $1 and $7 a day. So I was really interested that something that had this kind of mystical resonance was also economic, but also how to put this kind of huge amount of research that I'd done directly into the show. So my strategy was to kind of make these videos and installations that explored the kind of dreaminess and the effect of this substance that hovers around our imagination, but also to kind of embed the complexity of the research.
Is that the show?
This is the show, yeah. So I was interested in kind of how abstraction might be used as this very emancipatory space, but then similarly is used to grid out lives, technologies, bodily substances. So the whole thing becomes actually a diagram, both quantum entanglement and genetic exchange, and these milk proteins and guts, but it's also a stand and a reading room and a place to kind of absorb the complexity of the book, which was quite nice actually, because people then felt invited to stay and read it in quite a particular way, but left the artwork and, the films and sculptures to kind of have quite a different, to work, I guess, on a more immediate level. I like the idea that an artwork might work on different scales of time, that you have an immediate experience with it where it kind of opens up a certain effect, but then one can dig deep afterwards by reading a text or taking a text away. That's something that I really enjoy, where you might bring in, you know what I mean, there's different ways in which you can kind of take in its complexity at different times, which you seem to kind of, I suppose I was just really, I wanted to talk about this piece of work, but it's way hidden in my project. Which was also thinking about forms of female labour and, I suppose, authorship and cultural authenticity, which is when a story I read in a newspaper, an international newspaper, about a woman in China who left a rural location to go and work in a factory, and then it turned out to be making eyelashes, where you have to weave eyelashes. So I thought there was a connection there. And it takes, there's I think 180,000 strands of hair in each pair, but you have to make 25 pairs a day, and these are really high-end eyelashes that are made of human hair. And I was really interested in the story that apparently it was bonded labour, she had to make a certain amount every day to make the money, but actually that quota was impossible, so she tied a sheet to the window and ran away. and sold her story to the New York Times.
You've got more money from doing that.
Yeah, from the work. But then there's also that kind of neoliberal framing, which the art world also likes, of showing artists as a kind of victim position, to talk about its own intolerance, or, you know, where othering is often used to talk about kind of liberal democracy or the ethnographic turn in art, rather than actually profoundly challenging in the way that you have. What is art? Is the weaving art? Is the performance of the weaving art? Do you know what I mean? It's those kind of issues of actually what art can be and who it's for.
I think the challenge is always difficult though, because even with I wanted to actually put some data into my work, which was about, I went back to the curators who commissioned me to make this piece of work in the National Gallery, and we had these verbal conversations, and it was very clear in those conversations that there were no Malayan artists represented in the collection. But when I went back to them and said, so can I get some data on who is in the collection, and just to confirm, they kind of came back with a, we don't really want, you can't really say that.
You can't make that
you can't sort of make that statement so blatantly, you can't put that in there, out there. We want to do this project because this is great. We want people to understand that a first iteration of a national story is something that is we understand as a first iteration, and it will change, and more research needs to be done. You can't say that. And so I had my hands tied a bit. I can say it here, but I just couldn't put it into the work. And also then the way the work is experienced in the gallery is become something that's a tablet piece of work at the moment. And because of that,
tablet piece of work meaning
it's on a tablet, and this is interesting only that in Singapore there's a division between the National Gallery, which is showing modern work, and the Contemporary Gallery, and somebody had to come along, an official had to come along and say 1991 is where modern ends and contemporary begins.
Wow.
And seeing as that's the case, anything that you're trying to commission that's contemporary needs to fall within 10% footfall. So suddenly our project couldn't be the project, but had to be these smaller kinds of works, or works that
contextualizing.
The works now sit on these tablets that you can see them, they pop up in specific gallery spaces. So mine pops up in the gallery space with the Singapore art history. But I couldn't put the credits in of all the people I'd worked with, and I really tried hard. I basically, the whole film is made with women, and only women. There are a couple of men that are in the film, but the crew is a female crew, and setting that in Singapore was actually very difficult to do. But I couldn't even acknowledge that in my credits because there was not enough time.
Your screen time.
So that these kind of ideas of all these other things that we do, sometimes are very difficult to find a way of actually manifesting themselves, and they become stories we tell in these sorts of scenarios, or perhaps come through in publications, or they circulate in a different sort of a way, which I think is interesting, but also problematic too. But yes, so.
Yeah, I suppose taking control of that storytelling is something that I've been very conscious of, and trying to figure out how to do, both in terms of a kind of worry about speaking for or with, I guess, but also wanting to talk about the edges of one's implication in systems. You know what I mean? There's a kind of interest that I've always had in not speaking for or drawing circles around victims of, say, capitalist exchange, but actually figuring out how profound and deep that connection is, and how to articulate a kind of intimacy through it, I suppose, rather than, how do you avoid the kind of re-alienation of stories and things like that. So I think using ephemera and using text, trying to take some control of what's written about it. And when I showed this piece, actually made in China, which is when I'm just going to flick through some giant pumpkins, which are irrelevant to this story. And a whole load of stuff about some beautiful trees. So So these are different strategies of using, I suppose, objects with stories, and kind of refusing that art is either about singular objects or about films or about narratives, but actually insist that they have a big conversation with each other. And that's a constant through my work and something I'm kind of really curious about in yours as well. Oh God, where did the story go? I made this piece called Made in China about these eyelashes. I was interested in the idea of spectacle, the idea that she'd sell her story, that might be worth more than the labour itself, but then who was invested in that story. And I showed it in London, and as a sorry, it's right at the back of something. Okay, so I followed it. I wanted to change. I wanted to track this story going from rural China into the capital, working in these kind of factories and the escape. So I wanted to picture that, but also I was really interested in Chinese music and stringed instruments that I'd heard whilst I was in Hong Kong, where the strings are trapped, the bow is trapped in the strings, and I really kind of enjoyed that metaphor that the bow and the instrument could not be released from each other, they were absolutely entwined. And when I was in London, I found the only Erhu teaching in British music academies is by white ethno musicologists teaching Chinese students how to play Erhu, and there's a kind of interesting dynamic and reversal going on. In that, and so I shadowed somebody for a year watching them learn, and I built the lessons into the work and all the kind of cultural exchanges and conversations they had about layering the music. And I drew the whole story. I really wanted to understand it, and understand it as a kind of small act of resistance against a certain kind of labour condition. But then when I showed the work in London, I was allowed to make a book with it, and I showed it in Shanghai as well, made it with the book, and it opened up some really complicated discussions with Chinese artists about whether the work was criticising the Chinese system, whether I had a right to critique the Chinese system. And then it showed in Chicago, where the whole show was kind of hijacked and turned into a horrible discussion about a kind of critique of Chinese industrial relations and a kind of triumphalist American spectre. So they curated Chinese and non-Chinese artists who'd made work about China, and kind of wrote it in a very triumphalist way about the kind of the breaking of the kind of, you know, the fact that China would allow capitalism in such a profound way proved that America got it right, which was a real shock to me. Do you know what I mean? It was. So my writing was occluded. It wasn't put in the show. The piece was just held there as a kind of tragedy rather than as an act of resistance and an act of mutuality, which is what it kind of set out to be. And so, yeah, I mean, there's no answer for these things, and as you're saying, the museum often takes over. So in that instance, they didn't make the press release till the day of the show. So I couldn't even withdraw from it, because I didn't read it until the opening, which was a real shock. And I think since that point, I've really, really thought about how insisted that I always see the press releases first, or think about how, you know, how one can do that and fold in acknowledgements or collaborations together.
Yeah, I just, I mean, in a way that just reminds me perhaps of something that I've probably always had to do in this is where I have to go to biography, and I try and avoid sort of biographical stuff often, but so practicing in Britain for the last 20-25 years, my work has been framed in lots of different ways, often to do with cultural diversity and othering that goes on
with that.
Yeah, so you know, in a way, the kind of way in which artwork is instrumentalized constantly is something that I feel I work through constantly with my work. And it's still something I do, or have to do. Maybe I'm more aware of it now than I was. There was a moment in time where I suddenly realised I felt like I was a bit of a tool. And I then tried to take steps to have more control about the way in which something is presented or represented or framed. Except that I'm also very interested in these things. So I'm going to jump off from your piece of, because you're talking about Chinese music, that will bring me just very easily into Okay, so maybe I can take us to, yes. So, okay, so it's a piece of work that revolves around both a location in Plymouth, which is a National Trust house that has a lot of chinoiserie wallpaper in it. It's well known for its chinoiserie. But then the way in which that also, I think about chinoiserie in terms of sound. So the Oriental Riff. Have you ever heard of the Oriental Riff?
Do you know what she
Da, da,
was?
da, 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 da. You know that? Yes. The way in which that kind of a riff carries on. I mean, sort of early 1800s it was used. I have another talk where I bring all this stuff out. But it's still used today, and it's used as a way of transporting people. So I end up making a piece of work in a National Trust house and bringing in some young Chinese guys and women from Britain to try and do something that I'm interested in and still very interested in doing, which is about entanglement. So trying to find the resonances that perhaps are more invisible or lesser known. And the way in which this is sort of house, if you see the dates, there's also on the right the opium ships in Linton Harbour. So it's around similar periods of time, which bringing these things together just says that National Trust mansion house is only possible because of the trade relations with China, the difficulties there. So it's about
that traffic, which I'm sure you all know, that opium out to China and imported silks, textiles.
Yes, so that's what brought these materials in, but that's also kind of the discrepancy, the inequality of trade that led to the kind of wars. But so how can you think about Saltram House without also, how do you just go to Saltram House and look at the chinoiserie wallpaper without thinking about these bigger superstructural kind of relationships?
Which continue,
So, which continue, and so this is, in Saltram House, there was a film that was made which was called Sense and Sensibility. Copy that was then, dubbed, and that was very significant. So kind of, I have a recreation of this moment in the film that I made. But I don't think I'm showing you. I can show you a little clip from this, but it's in 3 parts, and I really want probably good time just
to move to the least,
So, it's very much about the house, but it's also about imagining forward that in 2020, I think it was, or 26, I said, this is when this takes place. And I'll just kind of, there's lots of objects, so it kind of explores various objects in the house itself. This is the chinoiserie wallpaper. But then there are these figures, these young male figures who are in the house and you're kind of not quite sure what they are. But they're doing the job of the daily conservation that takes place in the house. And then there are these other sort of shadowy figures in the dark. And then there's a series of figures where these guys are making or remaking. And there's an incorporation of sound here without subtitles. Can anyone speak Mandarin? Yeah? A little bit. I don't think you can hear it enough, but it's that has nothing to do with the actual thing that you're seeing. So they're kind of playing around with the sound, appropriated sound. So this is the moment of trying to bring Hugh Grant, Lee together with. I'm just trying to go through it quickly. So. So also the role of reflexivity, I think, in work is very important for me. So the moment where you hear the director sort of instructing her, or the moments where I actually am included in work, is something that's used. And then there's this, these boys and the carpet, because the carpet was a fake replica of the carpet that's there was made for Sense and Sensibility so that they can film on top of it. And there it is now, it's there. And they still have this fake carpet, so there's also something about fakery, mimicry, pirating that comes through all of this, which goes into this work. So it's work in 3 parts. This is called Chinese Chippendale. So this furniture here is Chippendale furniture. So Chippendale had 4 styles of furniture, one of which was Chinese. And so this is what Chinese Chippendale becomes. So they do this dance to the music that is a cover version of an Italian #1 hit called Boys, 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 but it's in Chinese. And
did you play it back in the house?
No, it wasn't shown in the house. This was a sort of a work that you could download off the internet. The other piece was a projection. So there was some kind of idea of bootlegging here. But it ends with them stripping down and being told to sort of do it again. And then the third piece is called After Chinoiserie, which goes back to your comment about music. So it was looking at not the sort of idea of the optics of chinoiserie in terms of wallpaper design, but thinking about music, so the Oriental riff, the way in which it has developed and stays with us today. So this is a piece of work that was made with a sound designer who wanted the who wanted to put loads of things into it, but I asked him to stay strictly with the music that is here.
The whole world is going
and it really it sort of revolves around a list of music that I found that had this Oriental riff within it. So the boys now finish their striptease. There's this listing going on, and then they start.
And are they striptease artists?
No, they're all students.
You just talk to me.
So yes,
Because they're confident performers, aren't they? I wondered if they were.
no, well, some of them are actors, but there are some that are just like the guy in the middle. He just only started learning to breakdance, and he was a very nice guy, very, very enthusiastic, but wasn't a great dancer. But and you can sort of see that somewhere along the way. You realise they're not really. But there are kind of moments where I also appear here, sort of instructing them, and everything is kind of constantly spinning and circular. that's going back to the music thing. So the person I worked with, Neil Rose, was very, very interested in Chinese film and music, and wanted to sort of be able to go off-grid and use various things like herbs. And we had a bit of a struggle, because actually what I wanted it to be was sort of, in a way, a deliberation on the kind of music that had already been produced, and a way of doing something with that. And we called it after chinoiserie because, you know, there is no after. It's sort of, you know, it's continuation.
Yeah. Whereas mine, I suppose, was just that kind of that paradigm shift of trying to teach authenticity, which is a kind of tautology anyway. And so yeah, it was a similar interest, but they just a very different way around it.
Well, that thing of teaching authenticity or authenticity, there's I did a project in Brighton Pavilion. Is it called Brighton Pavilion? It's so are you from Brighton? Yes, there's a pavilion there, and it's apparently it looks like the Taj Mahal, and the inside has got a lot of stuff that looks like it's from China.
But it's a mad conglomeration of everything.
But it's very Chinese inside, but only 3% of the objects come from China. The rest is, you know, fabricated. And what's very interesting is that there's a lot of Chinese characters being painted in the building. And a project I did brought in the Chinese community group who came in, and we did tours. And they were all in hysterics about the Chinese characters because none of them made any sense. And it was really only at that point did the curators really realise how much was sort of, you know, how much seemed to pass as Chinese, but definitely wasn't.
I can't believe they haven't ever got anybody in to...
They must have at some point, but what was more interesting for me was actually that the Chinese community then wanted to do their Chinese New Year celebrations in the space, and the museum decided, okay, you know, let's talk, you know, we're talking about inclusion, expanding audiences, so okay, we'll say yes. And they only did it once and they'll never do it again because the Chinese community came and they had a great time. But it was like, the museum was like, oh my God, no, you know, be careful of this, be careful of that. And it was just impossible to make these sort of things happen. But another interesting story about that space was that during the Second World War, the Gurkha soldiers, or soldiers from India as well, all the soldiers that weren't from Europe who needed looking after were put in Brighton Pavilion because they thought they'd feel more at home in a place that has more of an Asian feel to it. Yeah.
I think it'd be nice just at the end of this now, we've been talking for nearly an hour, but I just wanted to kind of, with the mention that you both embrace and cut yourself away from autobiography, but it is something that I think has become more interesting recently. I think there's been theoretical turns with auto theory, with Maggie Nelson with The White Cube, if you all know the reviewers who write The White Cube, that actually the spectre of turning it through the personal and getting rid of the fourth wall as if there was a kind of authority position to have on art has refreshed a lot of work and refreshed the way that a lot of women can use perhaps personal stories without it being kind of impacted back onto the autobiographical. I think it's opened up a kind of theoretical complexity where one can bring that to the table and not have it dismissed in the way that women's work always used to be. You know, men do, the cliche was that men talk about the universal, women talk about the autobiographical. And so much work has happened, I think, in the last 20 years particularly, that for me as a young woman artist felt really impossible. To make work about maternity or myself felt like everything would be sucked into that like a vortex, and I wouldn't be allowed to have any commentary about politics or philosophy or anything like that. But I do think there's a turn now where that work from the 80s, it was kind of viewed through an essentialist lens by the feminism or othering, is now given much more serious. Its complexity and its seriousness is opened and legible with ontological shifts as well. And I think just as well talking about the fact that you also trained in anthropology, and anthropology itself has just gone through a massive ontological turn and decolonialise itself. It's been quite interesting. Well, it hasn't, but it's on the table for discussion. It's been quite interesting. But I think the fact that you might trigger your research here in Kingston, bringing together kind of conclusions of personal stories and bigger cultural stories that are being told.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think it's a nice moment maybe to just open up how that might begin for you here.
Okay. Yes, so I mentioned sort of briefly to you that I might include my mother in my next work. I say that, I can't even say, even though what you say is true, I just put out something, my mother, you know, my mother, can't even say that. And so yes, so I'm the Stanley Picker Fellow in Fine Art, and I've just started, and it's fantastic to be here and be thinking about, just at the right time in a way, to close off the last project and start a new one. And I did come here with the idea of doing something about Raffles, Sir Stamford Raffles, who supposedly founded Singapore, a male figure, and to think about a major historical figure as opposed to a minor historical figure, and what would that do? But having got here, David pointed out a few things to me about this place that have been sort of recurring in my head. And the first, well, not really first, but in a way we'll just talk about this because we're in this site. That this site, this island, was apparently a factory for coconut fibre products. Yeah. I haven't managed to find enough about it yet, but people that know this area know there's a pub down the road called the Coconut, so maybe that's also influenced by that. But so on the top up there is actually London Docks, more East End, which is where I am in, and those are all coconut.
It was a huge industry, wasn't there, in weaving fabrics and brushes and all kinds of
brushes, yes. So thinking about brushes, these are the bog standard brushes, but there are also brushes for painting. But then things like the coconut shire being so central to this idea of traditional fairs in Britain. To East Ender sort of, using. There's also a clip of, I think it's King George at a coconut shire. Hang on, growing coconut.
I've done loads of research into coconuts actually.
Have you? Oh, well, I'll have to talk more. So that's interesting, but I really like the idea about the coconut, because coconuts also link back to Southeast Asia and to South Asia. And I find myself constantly always trying to find these linkages between the sort of transnational sort of mapping out. But I like the idea that coconuts are independent travellers. Just that idea for me is brilliant. They sort of float along the sea and they can migrate in sorts of ways that, are go across boundaries and all this. So the independent traveller is around that. So Dora Godin, so Dulwich House is part of the University of Kingston, and unbeknown to me when I came for the interview here, I hadn't put two and two together, but actually in my research on the Forgotten Weaver, I'd actually come across Dora Godin before. She was an artist that, for me, what's interesting is that she spent something like 5 years out in Singapore, Malaysia, making work there. And this is a picture I saw in Dulwich House, and it's not very clear, but the background of the studio there is made up of atap, which is a kind of palm leaf structure. This is a head that the Tate Britain owns of one of her sculptures that they've actually made into a 3D model. You can see it online. It's a 3D model.
Yeah.
This is her house. This is upstairs of Dulwich House. This is a lot of her house has got these kind of references to China. So this moon gate is there.
And also this is part of the Kingston estate.
Yeah.
Right.
And up there, I'm not sure if that's a Javanese woman, if it's the same woman there or not. And then I don't know if that is the Godin sculpture, but they're basically they're in the Forgotten Weaver. In certain moments, I do this kind of fly through, and I've flown through past some of her work. That whether or not it's actually in the show or not, it is in digital models. So I've already kind of come across her before coming here, and then realising that she'd spent some time in Singapore. And then this is an artist called Kim Lim, who's now started to become quite sought after. People wanted to show her work. But she was an artist from Singapore that came to Britain and married William Turnbull, the sculptor. It was always slightly eclipsed by his well-knownness. But she's got a lot of work in Tate as well. But, and she did show in Singapore, but it's only, she's passed away now, but it's only recently that her work has started to become well-known. And it's interesting that she, in Singapore now, is buying her work and wants to show her and wants to sort of welcome the idea of her coming back, because she's spent a long time away.
What's her connection with here?
No connection here except through me. So this is a really speculative piece of work. This is where maybe I start often, but maybe this is more like this than I've worked before, which is very much wanting to explore the idea of entanglements, but not entanglements that actually already exist, but entanglements that come through me, that I see.
You can make.
Yes. So it's almost wondering whether or not I can place myself in that position of author, and bring together. I mean, so just to mention, today I got an email from an art historian in Singapore who knows a little bit about Dora Gordine, knows about Kim Lim, and I just mentioned something about them. He said, well, these two artists weren't really in the same era. Their work is very, very different, and the only thing that might, connect them is maybe being diaspora artists. I was thinking, well, yeah, that's, but I liked his very dismissive tone of the potential that I might bring these two figures together. And this is my mother's work, who, in a way, it comes from this because I started destroying my mother passed away 10 years ago. We've been keeping her work. We can't keep it any longer. We're starting to burn it. And in burning, it felt awful. But she was self-taught, although she did go to the Nanyang School of Art and learn sort of Nanyang style painting. And then she also was self-taught in terms of ceramics, and she was very interested in kind of localized knowledge around making kilns, and so she did a lot of work that looks at regional sort of firing, making kilns and firing pottery. And then that's her there with the guy touching her hair. She went to Goldsmiths at the age of 50 and basically came back to England from living in Singapore and went to college and studied art. But I think the reason we're getting rid of her work, well, there's a question about keeping material, archives, and the reason for doing it, and whether or not she's significant enough. And I suppose in the back of my mind is she'll never be significant enough in Singapore history because she will not be accepted as part of the history of art in Singapore because of her otherness in that particular place. So there is no reason why they would be interested in her archive and her work. And in terms of Britain, she was out of this country for too long for it to have any significance here either. And I'm not quite sure where to go with this, but there is something about that position that she has, and then something about Kim Lim's position also in Britain, and then something about Dora Gordine. But also this idea that Dora Gordine and Kim Lim had left behind a huge amount of work and an estate and kind of material and archives. And I have a lot of stuff from my mum's.
But without the architecture.
Without the architecture. Yeah. So one of the ideas might be to bring everything here to this space that I might be allowed to use, bring it all here and unfold it and actually try and do something with it that then creates a possibility of showing work. I've got to figure out why I'm showing this work, but perhaps it's about archives, perhaps it's about stories, perhaps it's about very strange coincidences that I see in things, and giving myself permission to make these, kind of coconuts somehow bob around together.
Yeah.
So that's where I think we might end.
And where you might begin, yeah, fantastic. Thank you.
Excellent. So do we have any questions from the audience? Yes.
I want to ask again about your mom's artwork that you're destroying? Like, is it in the process you're trying to, like, you just have a thought that let's destroy it so you're gonna find out later, like, why you did it?
Well, I have two siblings, and we did get all together at one moment in time, and we sort of picked out the things we hated the most. And then we thought fire would be a really good way of celebrating it. So in a way it was part celebration. But I think it was having done it, and then filmed it, and then sort of looking back at the filming of it, it felt very violent. And then a friend said, "Oh my God, no, what are you doing?" This is a curator in Singapore who has no intention of helping me or buying the work or anything like that, but said, "Oh my God, you can't do that." But I live in London, I can't.
Really calls into question, like, why do things stay cut? Why are things canonised? And it's often because they're in a Hasley museum. If they're not Hasley museum,
There's no purpose for them to
well, it's
be.
not perfect, but there's nowhere for them to afford to. How do you afford to keep these objects alive? You know, it takes a huge infrastructure to keep objects alive.
Yeah, it goes back like in a circle. So, like in your budget again, like you may want to keep it, but like
You can't.
basically.
I have to find, I think in my mind, I'm thinking if I can find a way, a significance from it, it's like I need to find a way of putting value on it. And it's very strange because in a way it has value, but a lot of it has value to my mother, who's not around any longer. My sister's a curator, and she's very interested in objects, and one of the things my mum's kind of given us, I suppose, is our interest in objects and collecting things. So actually, originally, what I wanted to do was to get my sister involved as a curator of objects myself, and then have a three-way kind of conversation between three women, so my sister, my mother, and me. And one of the things my mum also collected was ceramics, and regional ceramics from Southeast Asia. And we've been told that they're worth nothing. As kids, we always thought, oh, they're very up there on the shelf, very important. But they're not really worth anything. And then we realised that she chose them because, as she also made ceramics, she was interested in the glazes, the way they were made. So they were sort of...
So the value might be in terms of performing cultural vernacular.
Yeah. So that's interesting. But then you need to spend time with those things. You need to see across the ceramic to the writing to the photographs, and then that takes a long time. Now, I already thought about it in my head about this opportunity I have to make work over a year and a half here. I thought, do I want to spend it a year and a half looking at my mum's work? And there's part of me that said, no, I can't do that.
But so much of it keys into these other...
It's very important to me, but I can't, I have to, in a way, I have to find my own position within it, and what relevance I can make of it to almost justify keeping it. And I mean, it's not a fixed idea. I might change my mind, but at the moment I don't know how to cope actually with it. I don't know what to do with all the stuff. I don't have a big house.
Yeah, I understand. But
Interesting to lay it out there.
Yes.
It's laid out, so you see it all together.
Yeah. Yes.
Did you see Andy Holden's piece where he inherited his Grand Lieutenant cat collection of porcelain and pottery cats? It's an interesting piece, I like it a lot. He's kind of figuring out some of the same problems and questions, and what is art making, what is valued as art, what is a kind of amateur collection, what is an art collection, but through these really kind of kitsch objects, which is also ambivalent about, because they're both huge sentimental value put them on as well.
Yeah.
It's nice.
Sentimental is interesting.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I was going to say that because you said that Singapore is not interested for your mom's work, so Britain is not interested. But now that your mom's work comes through you, like they see through you, and maybe it becomes interesting to them. And now that they don't exist, it's like it's an archive that doesn't exist, so it's adding like to the mystery. So maybe they become. So maybe like that now if they don't exist.
So then in a way what we're saying is that the value of her work is through its connection to me.
Yeah, you become her proxy.
Yeah. So it's this thing again, which is interesting.
It's the same thing
You
that
try
we
and go
did with-
towards something,
Yeah.
but actually you eclipse it somehow or other. Or maybe you eradicate it. So one of the things I found with the weaver in 1924, I found this information about weaving in Southeast Asia, hand weaving. And the same time that they were here showing their demonstration of the craft, in Malaysia, the graph goes, when they were showing it, the graph was up here. 10 years later, hand weaving was down here. They've like almost eradicated after this exhibition. In that exhibition was also tigers, stuffed elephants, stuffed tapirs, and again the decimation of those species.
Extinction,
Yeah. Something about showing and
Extinguishing.
seems to go hand in hand.
And it's the same thing because you said you had to pay like 4,000 to film like the process.
Yeah.
So basically now that you film like the process, they don't exist anymore. So just maybe it's like it adds like to the vibe. So it's like connections everywhere.
You're going to be busy.
Interested in whether the kind of proximity of the material to you, because it's your mother, sort of compromises your relationship with it. And I'm only saying that because I kind of identify with that as having lost a mother.
Yeah.
But no objects are kind of no object does it. And I think that's kind of complicated. So in a way, you could say that those objects, if I were to look at them, they sound as though from what you described, they kind of embody her movement between flip-flapping between these places and getting lost between them.
Yeah.
I wonder whether what you've done, what you seem to have done historically in your work is kind of give the material to someone else to...
I did think that it could be interesting to involve other people in perhaps going through this material as an exercise of constructing an archive. I think it could be really interesting because there's a lot of material there that's written stuff and photographs, and you can suddenly see she's done a drawing and then you can suddenly see a photograph of the work, and it's amazing. For me it's really great when that happens, but yes, what I'm not sure about is whether that's because I have access then into something my mother was thinking about, or whether that, just in terms of when you're producing an archive or putting information together, that is a moment where something starts building up. So it could be interesting to do that with other people. But there's part of me that still feels like I want to do that somehow as part of the work.
Yes, I think I was thinking exactly that. That's what you've done in your work. With the young men.
Yes, always
flattening and sort of, I can only put it quickly, but like mapping of piece of information from one place to another.
And we're also knowing that it's not just in the object, it's in all the things that happen around the object and through the object. And I mean, that's, to me, what storytelling is. It's not having a single narrative.
Or maybe it's this thing about using other people to tell the story, like slightly making myself removed. I think that's how I've always seen it. Which is why maybe if I'm the only thing that links things here, there's sort of for me a little bit like, I'm at the moment where I said, can I do this? I'm not, can I do it? Yeah.
I'm just wondering, did your mother leave without giving any indication of what she'd like to happen to her archive, or was that a conversation that ever came up?
No. No, I'm not sure.
I'm just going to make you feel bad now.
No, it was very sad. She got Parkinson's and then she really lost the ability to speak. So, in a way, no. I mean, I think she used to look at me, and because she went to art college in her 50s, I helped her with some of her artwork, because it was sort of a similar period of time. And I do know one thing she articulated was a bit of, not jealousy, but sort of to see me go and do stuff that she couldn't do, because she could not physically do it any longer, was on the one hand good to see for her, and on the other hand it was also, she wanted to be doing that stuff. So So that doesn't really answer the question, but I suppose there is in terms of talking about some kind of way of, you know, trying to deal with people's wishes or carry something through.
It's really tough, isn't it? I was executive of a friend's estate, and she would like it to go in an archive, but an archive doesn't want it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
But the world is becoming digital also, so if you keep it as an archive like digital and you don't keep like the object, so...
But the digital only means something in this moment, won't it? While the digital is still very contemporary. In 20 years, there'll be different technologies that mean that still layers
So
of it.
we transfer like everything to something else, something new, from the form to digital to something else.
But it's an intervention still. And it's tough if there's material objects. Where do you put it's expensive, right? And
Value is great though, you know. Deals with something. And there is also within Chinese tradition, right?
yeah.
We burn things after people go. And, yes.
Do you think the worth or the value of an object is completely built upon the recognition that it received from the public or the audience?
No.
No.
So could you repeat that question? Sorry, I didn't.
Do you think the worth or the value of an object is completely built upon the recognition that it receives from the audience or the public?
No, I don't. And I know I've said that because it's kind of got no value, in a way it seems like because I feel I can not find a value for it, that I'm going to destroy it. I actually, I think that it's only myself and my sister that are going to really find some value in it. And if we haven't got the time to do that, what I'm aware of is my son. I don't want to leave my son with the same kind of burden of what to do. And I've said this a few times to myself, but my own artwork, I'm quite happy if my husband deletes all the files when I'm gone, that it doesn't exist any longer. But when I'm alive, I want my archive there so I can get hold of the work that I need. But I'm not so interested in that it continues after. And this might shape the reason why I feel like, you know, I can destroy things, because
You would do it yourself.
in a way, yes, there's a sort of, I want to be able to destroy
It is
it.
interesting.
I know somebody that's left their hard drives to an archive, and they're doing digital excavation of it, so they can figure out how he made decisions, how his bill paying and internet kind of queries correlated with his art production.
Yeah.
It's going to be used like forensically. And for me, the idea of that becoming part of the story, all my procrastination and Googling when I've got a difficult decision to make. You know what I mean? The way that those habits become enshrined in the hard drive and can be digitally excavated.
Awful.
I know, isn't it?
Horrible.
So think about what you do.
You're turning this back to
Yeah,